Hello everyone, and welcome to Pacing Considerations for Narrative Games. My name is Mads. I am the director at a little studio called Fiends, and I'm also the co-director at Freeplay. Hopefully some of you are coming to Parallels on Thursday. Yeah! So I make narrative games, and specifically I mostly make visual novels. So I've been making visual novels for about 8 years at this point. I started in 2015, spent 2 years working on my first game, Inverness Nights. After that, I spent a couple of years working on a game called Catacomb Prince. And for the past, Jesus Christ, 4 years, I've been working on this game called Draculeshti. But once, before all of this, I had another job. So for 6 months, back in 2018, I was a UX researcher at like a big corporation. So for those of you who don't have any kind of UX experience, obviously it's user experience research. In a corporate context, that basically means making sure that their apps and websites work correctly, people understand how to use them, and that when you log in to pay a bill or find out information on how much a service costs, all of that is easy to get access to. The big thing that you learn when you're doing corporate UX research is people are real anxious about pressing buttons. So a lot of customer service user experience is trying to find the fine line between how many buttons people want to press to get information and the point at which you've put too much in a single page, they're getting lost in all of the text that's in one place. Now, video games, typically you think of them as the opposite to a corporate website, in that people playing video games love to press buttons. It's why they're here. You press a button, exciting things happen. You swing a sword, you do a spell, all that kind of stuff. Until suddenly, it's not so fun. So in any game, no matter how much you love it, there is always a point where you get really sick of pressing buttons. Maybe you get bored, you've been doing the same thing for 10 hours and you've suddenly realized you no longer have fun running around this field. Maybe you're frustrated, you've been pressing these buttons and you can't figure out how to solve a puzzle or kill a boss. Maybe you're confused, you're pressing these buttons, they're no longer doing the things you expect them to. Or maybe you're just dissatisfied. You thought that there would be a lot more to something and suddenly it's turned out actually it was very simple and everything's over. Anticlimax. So there's this old paper that some people might be familiar with called Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics, which talks about this concept called uncertainty and inevitability. And basically, one of the ideas that this paper has is that people tend to like it when games have a certain amount of uncertainty, when you don't really know what's going on, but also a certain amount of inevitability. You want to start a game kind of figuring out what you're doing and finish a game knowing exactly what you're up to. Hey, I have these tools, I can do this, great. I've finished it and I'm happy. Basically what that boils down to is the question of the button did not do what I expected, or the button only ever does what I expect. So at this point you're like, oh Mads, this is a narrative talk, you're on the narrative track. You should start talking about stories or I'll cry. I am the source of your bad feelings. So the key idea of this talk, and the main thing that I want to sort of go over with you for the next 40 minutes or whatever it is the idea that pacing is basically balancing out the story content with button presses. So if a button press is the smallest unit of game pacing, I press the button, it does what I want when I want. Getting that level wrong starts to sort of have impact across the whole game. So first, it's that you're pressing buttons to get through dialogue and it's not going as fast as you want. Then it's, why did I spend 10 minutes talking to this character about bread? And then it's, oh my God, the baking story arc took 30 hours in this 50-hour game. And then you're looking back on the entire game and you're like, it was okay, but that baking arc, what was up with that? So to a certain extent, some of you are probably thinking oh, well, duh, that's obviously if people are annoyed when they're pressing buttons, that's bad for game design. Except there are a lot of like minutiae to how you make sure that button pressing is satisfactory and that, in that broader stroke, that story is satisfactory, comes down to thinking about those little impacts every time. So it's stuff like, how does your UI interact with how you're looking at dialogue and experiencing dialogue? What kind of expectations are people bringing to your game that are impacting how they understand the pacing? So, I do visual novels. People expect that they're going to be there reading for a long time. But if you're doing something like a narrative platformer, it might be about getting the balance between the text boxes and the jumping, right? Have you considered sort of quality of life features for narrative? So things like how fast your text appears, how large your text is it easy to read? Are you putting too many fun text effects in that are making it hard for people to get through the dialogue at a decent pace? Are there accessibility features you haven't considered? Like, this is one that's for everyone, not necessarily like with any vision limitations, but hey, there's probably a point where we've all experienced eye strain when looking at a video game because someone thought that the text was big enough when it's tiny, and now you're just spending ages trying to make out what's there, et cetera, et cetera. There are millions of these tiny little things that impact how people are engaging with dialogue as it appears in your game. So we're going to consider what impacts pacing and how all this sort of trickles down into experiencing a wider narrative. So I'd like to set up a few caveats before I go into the rest of the talk. This talk assumes that you are working on games where narrative is an internal priority. So I'm kind of talking about situations where you have like some kind of ability to basically say, hey, I want to do this with the narrative, and have people, accept that idea and value that that's an important part of the game. Also, at a greater level, it's awesome if you're able to impact things like the UI for your game, if you're able to say, hey, we should add this feature that'll make reading dialogue easier, because those are all things that I'm going to talk about that have a major impact on this stuff. Secondly, it's assuming that narrative is a draw for your audience, so that you're working on a game where you know that players want to see a story and have it told well. A lot of this matters way less if you're just throwing in a narrative box at the start of the level to explain why you're in the castle, and that's that. It's less applicable to games where you have fully animated cutscenes. So a lot of these points that I'm going to bring up are kind of assuming that there's some kind of interaction between you showing players the narrative and the narrative, appearing. I think those are tautologies, but anyway, basically if you're showing animated cutscenes, then that kind of offloads that into a different place. Is the storyboarding for those cutscenes good? Do people, it's a whole different ballgame. And finally, pacing is subjective. So you can go into everything with great intentions, think, deeply about like, here's my game, here's what I'm showing people, here's why they're interested, and here's the sort of situation I think they'll be playing it in. Then they just don't like it, or they don't, connect with your story, and you've written this emotional plot beat and they don't care. So while you can like do everything to try and make sure that like a game is paced as well as possible, there is no such thing as perfect pacing. It's like not a thing that exists. There is only doing your best and knowing your audience. So to kind of get everyone, thinking about the way that these UI aspects, impact how we, UI and other sort of display elements impact how we understand games. I've grabbed some short clips of a few games that I think are generally well paced. So all of these are very short bits of text, just 4 to 7 lines, and basically while I'm playing them, keep an eye on what the UI is doing, what's happening in the visuals, and also what's happening in the audio. I've grabbed these from all sorts of different places because, like I say, I do visual novels. My UI for all of my games looks pretty similar, so I don't have a good study in contrasts within my own work. So visual novel, you're just sort of clicking through, there's no delay between one line and the next, and the only thing that you're really looking at other than the text is the character sprite changing a bit. Next, stepping it up a little.
Who are you?
So Paradise Killer, it's still kind of in that lower end of things happening while the text is happening, but it's limited still to there's a sprite. This time you've got a bit of a text backlog that you're looking at, and there is some like sort of character voicing that occasionally plays when you're clicking through the dialogue. So Disco Elysium, now we've got more animations going. You're waiting a bit for a character to animate before each line appears. But on the flip side, the lines appear within the world, so it's easy to sort of keep going as they're popping up.
Ooh!
Dante!
Stay right there.
Okay.
And then at the extreme end of the scale, we've got an animated cutscene where everything is timed around what the visuals are doing, and it doesn't matter too much what the text is popping up, what the text is doing as it pops up, because it's all constructed around this cutscene. So, some of the factors that we look at in these sorts of scenes are how much is on the text to communicate what's happening versus how much is on the visuals to communicate what's happening. So a game where everything is down to you're waiting for the text to happen, and if art or anything changes, it's timed to the text and happens immediately. The text kind of has primacy there. Then you've also got how much is text versus how much is audio. So you might have a game where the UI appears immediately and delivers dialogue immediately, but there's voice acting or something that you're waiting to play out. And maybe there's an option for players to skip through it, but at least, at the beginning of the game, players will often want to sort of sit there and listen to the dialogue and get a feel for like what the characters sound like, that kind of thing. Other than those two factors, what limits the rate that the text appears? So that can be something in the engine that determines the rate that characters pop up, whether it's an entire text box appearing at once, like in Disco Elysium, or individual characters that kind of scroll along. And then also from one text box to the next, what is sort of creating the gaps between them? What's distracting the player from the text? So anytime you have visuals or audio, they're to some extent complementary, but to some extent, unless it's a cutscene sort of scenario where it's just like voice dialogue that's timed to the visuals, they're going to be drawing the player's eyes away from the text. Now, in something like Scarlet Hollow, where there's a character sprite that's just repeating through the same poses the whole time, it's not too bad because people will get a sense for like what the range of character sprites are, what might be up there, and fall into a rhythm. But if you are constantly bringing up different visuals, that's going to create breaks as people stop to actually look at what those visuals are. And then finally, what's occurring in the scene? So on one end, you're sort of looking at those other elements as something that creates breaks in the text, but then on the flip side, if you have something, really dramatic or impactful occurring in the scene, you want to highlight it in some way. So even with visual novels, for people who don't play them a lot, usually you'll have full illustrations when big moments in the narrative happen, just because it's a good way to draw people's attention to the fact that that is like a significant moment and they're supposed to be dwelling on it and looking at it for a while. So, across the board, there are kind of three things that I think we come back to generally when we're looking at pacing. First of all is the motivation, so what's sort of leading players from one moment to the next and across a whole game. Second is the interface, so what are they seeing at any given moment and how is that delivering the narrative to them. And finally, just the medium in general, so there are things that work in games that don't work in other mediums and vice versa. And leaning on techniques that you've borrowed from other places is obviously, as I'm sure you're all well aware, often a death trap because, there are different things that people are playing games for and also different sort of expectations that they have. So, breaking it down. Motivation. When you're playing other sort of less narrative-focused game genres, or even sort of things with a bit of hybridity, button presses always have some kind of motivation behind them. So if you're playing something like Stardew Valley, you want to press the button so you can plant your crops and make sure that the garden grows. If you're playing Street Fighter, you want to press the button so you can punch the guy, and ideally punch him so good that you win. If you're playing Celeste, you want to press a button so good that you climb the mountain at the end. In all of these other game genres, people are thinking constantly about how to make sure that each of those button presses feels good and it takes you somewhere valuable. So, if someone is programming a platformer and you say, the jumping is floaty, and they say, I don't care, does it really matter, it's just a platformer, that would sound really like, what are you doing? But a lot of people will go into making narrative games without sort of thinking about this basic economy of like, hey, when people are pressing buttons, how do I make sure that feels good and it's delivering the outcomes they want? So I think a general rule of thumb that's good to have is people start pressing buttons because they're there, like the Milgram experiment guy who pressed the electric shot button 190 times because it was better than being bored. People will keep pressing buttons if you give them a reason to, and you've got to give them that reason. If we think about like the general arc of a game, a lot of the time you'll come to it with a broad idea of what the plot is doing. Mario is going to save Peach, and that's the motivation. But coming up with like a motivation to go through each individual moment of the game is where it gets a little bit harder and a little bit muddier. So with something like Silent Hill, the overall motivation is to get out of Silent Hill and save your daughter. And then in any given moment, the motivation to play through a particular scene is usually, it's scary, I need to get out of here. There's a weird dog, I've got to run. Another way you can think about it is inertia. So other mediums like books or film have a lot of inertia built into them. You start reading a book, and unless it's House of Leaves, which is pictured there if people aren't familiar with it, the text is doing some weird stuff. So unless you're reading that, you generally start reading a book, you know where the next line is, you just keep reading line after line. Eventually you get to the end. Or you don't. I have a massive pile of half-finished books on my bed, so maybe this isn't such a great point. Then on something like TV or movies, with Netflix and other streaming services, you finish an episode and it comes up with the, want to watch the next episode? We're going to autoplay it. So you have the inertia of the series just keeps going as long as you're there. In games, you have to keep on making the thing happen. So as much as I, have been enjoying playing Baldur's Gate 3, every time I want to do something in that game, I have to sit there and think like, okay, this is the thing I'm going to do next, and this is what I'm going to press to make it happen. There is an older book called Narrative as Virtual Reality, which describes this as immersion versus interactivity. I don't know if I like those terms because they're kind of ambiguous, but basically it's the idea that like in games, because you have to keep pressing buttons, people have to keep on buying into what they're doing. So I think some common types of in-the-moment motivation you can consider for like writing dialogue that sort of keeps people clicking through it can be things like mystery, so the desire to figure out what happens next, giving people clues that they can put together about where a plot is going, not necessarily even in a mystery narrative, just the basic sort of stuff like, I wonder if it's Jeff who's the villain, or did Jeff do this crime, or whatever. Emotion, so getting people to like emotionally invest in a scene, so they want to keep on going through it because there's some kind of feeling that they're getting from it. Excitement, so people wanting to keep going with the scenario because they're really sort of invested in the excitement of what happens. Often that's for like action scenes or big plot moments. And then anticipation, so the belief that something exciting is just around the corner, and if you keep going, you will hit the exciting thing. So some of the examples that I have here from my current game, Draculeshti, we've got a scenario where the player character, Renfield, is he's just hanging out. A bunch of people have shown up at Castle Dracula, which is exciting because he's been trapped there with just Dracula and Dracula's brides for several days. But the people keep on talking about some kind of mysterious party that's happening tonight, and he's not invited. What's going on there? The second scene is one which is basically just meant to be a breather inside like a very tense situation. So because the setup for the game is that, you know, you're stuck at Castle Dracula, players are kind of meant to be looking for those moments where they can just relax and not worry about something killing them. And so one of the love interests, the big setup scene for them, is that they just invite you to breakfast and you have a normal breakfast and everything's good. And when we put it in the game, a couple of the team members were like, I don't know like if this is going to be boring for people, what the deal is going to be with this one. And I was like, just trust me, I feel like this will work. And every time people have played through that scene, they've been like, yeah, the breakfast scene is my favorite. Thanks for giving me that one time I'm not worried someone's going to murder me. Excitement, we've got a scene where you realize, oh no, I think someone's getting murdered at Dracula's mysterious party I'm not invited to. And so you go on like a big run through the house to try and get down there and see what's going on and if you can help. And if maybe you should leave, because if he's murdering people, that's not great. And then finally, anticipation. So we've got a choice here where players can decide whether to, you're on a hunting trip with Dracula, and you can decide that, actually, I'm out of this one. He's trying to get you to go onto a cave that's covered in black ice and on a precipice, and you're pretty sure that if nothing mauls you in the cave, you're going to fall to your death. And you can either say, nah, I'm going home, or you can be like, actually, I want to see if I can like deal with this cave in a way that doesn't kill me. And a lot of people who have played through that chunk of our demo have basically been like, well, I've come this far, I do want to see what happens next with that thing. So they end up picking that option. Some other types of motivation. First of all, the different motivation types I think are non-exclusive. You know, you might have a blend of them in different scenarios. You might have a really emotional scenario that's also a really big action scene where people are very excited. You might have excitement and anticipation at the same time, like, oh my God, stuff is happening, and I think it's going to happen even more in 5 minutes, and all sorts of other combinations. Other motivations that I haven't picked up are possible. It's not meant to be a comprehensive list, just some things you can consider as reasons people would keep clicking from one text box to the next. And lastly, I think like novelty and spontaneity and humor are really good reasons to put dialogue or scenes or whatever into a game. But naturally, the diminishing returns on surprising people are much higher than every other type. So if you're doing something to be novel, being careful that you're not repeating yourself is really critical. This GIF is from a game called Illbleed. It's from, I think, 1999. I love this game. It's a game that's just, you have to try and survive a cursed theme park. And all the game is you walk through the theme park and you have to mark the places you think a jump scare is coming, and if you don't mark them correctly, the jump scare happens. So it's just a whole game of weird stuff happening, like this evil cake. It's great. Please go look up a Let's Play of Illbleed or something. So on the topic of diminishing returns, every type of motivation has diminishing returns. So every time you start invoking them, you have to think, how powerful is this motivation in this scenario? How long will it last? People might be curious about a character hearing a mysterious noise for a couple of lines, and then it'll die down if they start suspecting that, like, it's a cat or, you know, just some random guy and not the murderer. And motivation is also subjective, especially with things like trying to, you know, get people to buy into a scene emotionally. That's one that can, like, really pitfall if, you know, you've overestimated people's connection to characters. Even if just the wrong person is playing it and doesn't sort of feel anything for the cast, it can kill things off. So being aware of, like, hey, I think we can sustain this for this amount of time, and then we should, like, try and figure out a different way to keep people buying in is crucial. So on the topic of subjectivity, some people would look at this and be like, whoa, and this is just a bit of interstitial dialogue. This is from Metal Gear Solid 3. I love this. I love every time you call up a character in this game and they just give you a spiel about whatever they're thinking about, in this case Dracula, which is why I included it. But, you know, for some people, that's not compelling. Metal Gear Solid 3, much beloved game. So, you know, it is just a lot of the time a matter of taste. And then equally, sometimes you'll be playing a game and this is all you'll get. And that's great. That's all you want. So you do really have to judge based on sort of vibes. So moving along, interface. There are a lot of different ways to present text in a game, as I was saying earlier, and interface can help or hinder the way that you're displaying certain types of text. So, like, Undertale is a great game that does interesting things with interface all the time, like in this clip. And it kind of shows the power of, like, messing around with different displays to, you know, highlight but potentially distract, and, you know, balancing the two at any given point. Cool. So we're making Dracula HD in a dedicated visual novel engine called RenPy. So a lot of people are like, oh, why are you using the really, like, niche bespoke engine that's just for this stuff? Isn't that going to be complicated for porting? The answer to that is yes, but here are the benefits of using RenPy. Ooh. Okay, it is working now. I turned off the music, but not the sound effects, so. That takes half an hour to play through normally. So RenPy, the beauty is you can get back to any point in the text super easily. If people want to replay a game, it's pretty much frictionless. It is magnificent for anything that you're creating, like a lot of variables, a lot of branches, a lot of endings, which we are. And so for us, using an engine and building a game around the idea like, hey, ideally people will play this at least twice, and so we need to make it as easy as possible for them to do that so that they don't start that second playthrough and think, oh, this is a waste of time, I don't want to do that. So things like engine and those overarching features are also a really important part of, like, how you engage with the game and how you know, overall that the experience comes together. So, like, for us, if people don't do a second playthrough, they will be missing out on massive amounts of the game. It's like a route-based narrative structure where there are 4 characters who each have an individual story. We've kind of structured it around the idea that if you play just 2 of the 4, you'll have a mostly complete experience, but that still does require people to play 2 of the 4. So we have to incentivize that. So that was, you know, a major decision for us in terms of setting up the game. Then, additionally, you have all of the normal moment-to-moment stuff. So earlier I was talking about the way that, like, visuals and audio sort of interact with the text, but also the text itself and how it's presented play a big part in how much people are willing to sit through and how easy it is for them to keep pressing through a game. So it just spins a little bit. It's not. So in our case, we've got like, it's a visual novel. We have pretty limited animations and that kind of thing. And we think that's a strength because it means that people can focus on the text, which is how we're delivering the narrative, which is theoretically one of the big draw cards for the game. As I was saying before, replayability. So as well as just the basics of like how are people doing a second playthrough, other things to consider as sort of overarching features are how people access new scenes. So if you're making a branching game and you know that there's like one scene people will want to play through again to see whether helping character A or character B makes a difference, making sure they can get back to that scene quickly is something that you should be taking into consideration. How do players keep track of what they have seen? So are you building any kind of like feature where people can look at a chart that shows what they've unlocked? Are you using, Steam achievements or something like that to track the different endings that are possible? All those sorts of little features that can help people understand what they've seen of a narrative and what they could go looking for. And also, how do players take control of what they're revisiting? So if you're making a branching narrative game, having a lot of save slots, really important. Making sure that you have looked into whether the engine you're using, can support that, if you've figured out how you're going to build it in, if it's not there already. So another great thing about RenPy, it gives you like 1 billion save slots. So we know that people can make saves and go back to scenes that they want to see and want to try different options in pretty easily. So just honing in on text itself, the more important that text is in your game, the more important that it is players have control over how and when they get to see it. If you want them to read, you should also want them to be able to read. This still applies if you're using voiceover, but this still applies if you're using voiceover, but reading is a priority for narrative delivery. So for instance, if you've got a game where people speaking is voiced, but you have narration that's not voiced or choices that are not voiced, people are still going to have to stop and look at those, and that's going to be an impacting factor on how fast they do things. So here are all of the different types of UI we tried for Dracula HD. Like I said, we've been working on this for like 4 years. I'm not the artist. The artist is my beloved teammate Penta. Penta made all of these different mock-ups. We tried them in Engine, and every time we would be like, it's not quite working. So the first one on the top left is the default RenPy UI. The one in the top middle was just like, hey, what if we moved the text box to the middle of the screen? Because that's where the sprites are. It'll work. It was really distracting. We didn't like it. The third one, so the one on the top right, is like, what if we just had a text log and the sprites either side? And then we realized that if we ever needed to port it to anything that's more of a vertical format, or even just deal with different screen widths, it would get really complicated, and it was better to keep things kind of centered. We had the same problem with the bottom left. The center bottom, I think that was the one we were closest to picking, and then we ran into the same problem where whichever sprite we pushed off to the far left could end up being sort of cut off depending on screen and resolution and stuff. And then we've ended with the one in the bottom right. So we went through all of this iteration, and then we ended up with something that's quite similar to the original RenPy UI, but there are a few things that we did to try and make it a little bit easier on people. So the text box is bumped up slightly from the bottom of the screen, and rather than having the sprites as like full body elements that you're trying to look at as you're reading, they're in those little boxes so that they can be nudged a bit closer to the text, and you can look more easily at hey, I only have to shift my eyes a little bit to see that this character is smiling now, or this character is frowning now. But yes, and this is how it looks in action. Yeah, so that is a scene where you basically show up to play billiards on a date with the bathroom ghost. At some point in like a team chat, I referred to him as the bathroom ghost, and then we decided it was funny because he's got the very elaborate, beautiful design, and it's such a deflationary thing to call him, and it stuck. So it's in the game now. But yes, so those are a bunch of things that I think are worth thinking about with the text display on any given game. If you don't have control over the UI for your game, obviously I had the luxury of doing a lot of back and forth with Penta and us deciding, what's best as a team for showing the dialogue. You might not be in that situation, but I think still, thinking about all of these sorts of factors and, working around the limitations of what you've been given is still valuable rather than just, doing it and hoping it'll look good in the end. Cool. So the last thing I want to cover off is talking about medium and how that affects pacing. So again, we're going to look at how different amounts of words look in different formats. So this is the first page of Pride and Prejudice. It's 87 words. It's all sort of squished in nicely, pretty easy to read because it's a book, and all you've got to do is look from line to line and then flip the page. Okay, so still staying on the printed word, here is a page from Swamp Thing, a comic I deeply adore. There are 122 words on that comic page, and they're all sort of squished around the edges. It is a really good comic, but people say that Alan Moore is verbose and like unusually sort of wordy for his medium, and this is like a classic example of why. It's all valuable stuff to read and you really buy into it, but you have to be willing to like sit down and engage with that kind of text layout. And if you're watching a movie, usually spoken dialogue, you can fit sort of 100 words a minute. Obviously lots of movies are not going for that density, but that's like what you're looking at when people start just talking back and forth. So in all of these other formats, you have like pretty reliable sense of how people are going to I forgot that I had that on there, and I was like, why is everyone laughing? So in all those other formats, you have like a pretty good sense of how long it'll take for people to get through stuff because it's kind of standard. There's a limited number of things that can interfere with how quickly they're moving through. And also with things like a movie, if you're sitting there and watching an edit and you're like, this is too fast, you can go back in and add like, additional establishing shots or something to slow it down. Games are a little bit harder because usually when you're trying to slow something down and make it a bit more digestible, the way that you do that is adding more game, and that's like adding more stuff that people have to click through. And again, you come back to the problem of hoping that it's all going to be stuff they want to click through. But by the same token, if you do just kind of slam every important incident in your game right next to each other, you get like a sort of whistle-stop tour kind of feeling. And it's one of those things where I think with the way narrative games are set up, there are very few scenarios where you'll be sitting there thinking like, that scene was very short, but there are lots of times where you'll be sitting there thinking that game was super short. So another way of thinking about this sort of balance is ambience versus frustration. So you want to create enough space that people can kind of sit with the game, especially if that's important, like themes or emotions or whatever sink in, but you don't want to make them frustrated and feel like it's going nowhere. So if people don't recognize the image to the right, it's from Stalker, and it's a very famous sequence where they just sit on a train for several minutes while it goes along the tracks, and that's like intentionally put in there to make you stop and think about the desolation of the zone and that sort of thing. So you kind of, a lot of the time you want to land somewhere in between Stalker and Knife Guy. So I think with games, because you have to sort of keep them moving in a way that makes it feel like that extra time is valuable, one of the big things is, do you have enough sort of incidents in there? And then are those incidents told in enough detail? Are there ways to intensify them to justify spending a little longer? And basically just thinking about like that scene construction level of, hey, adding extra dialogue is bad for this reason, but can I add an extra scene that's gonna like make things feel a bit better? And obviously that's easier if you're working on a game that doesn't then have to have a lot of animation and stuff added in. Ideally you have some way of doing this. I realize it's not always situationally doable. So we're going back to the ghost here for my example for this. So with the ghosts route, because the setup for Dracula HD is that you're trapped in Castle Dracula, it's one of those like setups where everything is moving on a very accelerated time frame, like the old Disney movie problem of you've known each other for a week. And so we've had to go back and forth quite a lot on like, how can we add enough incidents that it feels like you've spent time and you know this person, when like rationally people step back and they're like, you've known each other a week. So there are like two particular points that we identified as like major sort of, turning points in the plot, and we've basically had to say like, these are the places where we can fit in some extra scenes to create that breathing room, to create that sense that you know this character before we flip the chessboard and go, hey, new plot development, your relationship has changed, what do you do now? Then on the flip side of things, I think this part is like pretty standard writing practice. If you think something's dragging too long, is the scene pointless? Is the dialogue just too long? Maybe you should cut it. I mean, that goes for like every medium ever. Kill your darlings and all that. So yes, in conclusion, everything starts with a button press. It's easy to get people to start pressing buttons and harder to get people to keep pressing them. So you've got to be mindful about what each of those button presses is doing, why people want to press them, and where things are going. And then, in conclusion, think about how your narrative interacts with the motivation for players. What is it that's going to keep them pressing that button again and again and again until they get to the end of the game? What is it in your interface that's going to slow them down or annoy them? How do you work around that? And what is it about games that you can leverage to make your game feel better? And what is it that you might have been taking from other places that doesn't work so well in games? Cool. So you can find me on X, Twitter, on all good websites as Mad Max Fury Road, and my studio is at Fiends. And I think we've got like 5-ish minutes for questions. Yep, 7 minutes for questions. Cool. Any questions?
So you talked a lot about the effort it takes to get people to keep pressing buttons in games versus the natural inertia of other mediums. What, in your opinion, is the difference between pressing buttons to keep the story moving versus turning pages in a book? How does that differ?
Okay, so the question was, what is the difference between pressing buttons in a game and turning pages in a book in terms of sort of pacing and the way that this all shakes out? So firstly, most games are displaying text a single line at a time versus a book which is displaying, 100 words or 150 words. So you've got that element of they're just larger bits of text, and therefore if you're not having to expend that effort that frequently. There are lots of visual novels where I'll play and I'll hammer the button and it'll be just 100 presses and he made drowning noises because he was drowning. And I get to the end of that and I'm like, you made me press the button 100 times to get 150 words of dialogue, and most of those words were it's not satisfying. And then the other thing is that there is, confusion and indecision and things in playing games that there isn't in a book. It's, going back to the House of Leaves point, you have to read a book like House of Leaves to not know what you're doing next. But in not so much in, I guess, interactive fiction, visual novel type things, but if you're playing anything that has other systems involved, you do hit those points where it's he told me to talk to Daphne, but I have no idea where Daphne is in this town. And I've walked around and I can't find her, so I'm stopping. That doesn't happen in books, so yeah. Any other questions?
Do you have any advice for getting playtesters, or just in that whole realm of how do you figure out if the pacing is right for your product?
So the question was, how do you get playtesters and sort of get that feeling for what's right? So I have been pretty lucky in that we've had opportunities to have public playtests for Dracula HD, and I've been able to just stand there creepily in the background and be like, ooh, they spent a long time thinking about that cake choice. So if you see any opportunities to do playtests for your game, take them. The other thing is we've just built in a whole bunch of analytics stuff into our current build, and that'll mean that so we're at PAX Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Please come say hi. We're in PAX Rising. So that will mean that at the end we can see like what the playtime was, what people were choosing, and can have some conversations about like, for some reason everyone is dropping off at this choice. What's the problem in that section? So I think if you can't do stuff in person, making sure you've got analytics tools in the back end to think about like, okay, I can't physically watch people, but I still know where the problem points are. The Scarlet Hollow developers are people who have built like, they've built analytics into the back end of their games, and they've like done these really deep dive blog posts. I really recommend searching them and taking a look, where they talk about like, hey, we saw from this tool everyone was dropping off at this choice, and we changed the wording of the 3 lines before it, and now no one drops off there. It can be that simple sometimes. So yeah, just make sure you look for opportunities, build analytics tools. I think we have time for one more question.
Hey, you mentioned obviously with Greenpie, you've got the ability to kind of skip forward and everything like that. Do you find though the disadvantages of using various engines affect the way that you actually create the story, build the story?
So that was a question about do the disadvantages of various engines like impact the way you create a story? So when we were thinking about what we were going to use, the other big thing that visual novel developers use a lot is a Unity plugin called Fungus. We went through reviews for a lot of games that were using Fungus to see how many times it lacks, it has less save slots, the skip features aren't very good, and sometimes it'll have delays between loading different lines of dialogue. And so we basically picked through all these games when you were using it to see how many people were complaining about that stuff. And like a shocking number of reviews were saying, hey, I wanted to replay it, but replaying it is a pain. I wanted to see all these different options, but I only had 2 save slots, or it only uses autosaves. And I was really disappointed because I only saw 1 of 5 characters. The others just weren't worth my time. So in our case, we like did see that evidence that people, run into those as friction points. I don't know, because we, did end up going with RenPy, and I don't personally have any friends who are using Fungus. I haven't been able to check, since you presumably know these are problems people run into with these engines, are you doing anything to mitigate those problems? I'm sure they must be. I hope they are, but who knows? And yeah, I think that's time. Thank you very much for coming.